Brings up a very important point about your writing that I think ought to be highlighted, and that is the extraordinary importance of place, even in the new novel. I mean, when you started talking about it, you talked about it from the west side to the east side, and, it takes us through a whole section of New York and Hell's Kitchen and in terms of his past and so forth. Underworld is a novel, I remember when you were on tour and we were talking about it, that people from New York, especially from the Bronx, loved because they felt so immersed in that world, that the feel, the touch, the smell, and all the senses being assailed the way you so remarkably bring graphically and vividly to life. Setting and the sense of your being connected to the setting, connected to the place, and anchored to the place seems to be of preeminent importance, Steve.
That's true. I'm always writing about where a character is, even if it's a room. I want to know something about the table he is sitting at or the chair he's sitting on, what he looks like, the dimensions of the room perhaps, and then beyond the room. This is of crucial importance to me, and it's not something I ever planned or even think about. It's just there. I think I'm a very visual writer,
yes.
and for this reason, I want to know where people are when they're doing whatever they're doing, and at least in a rough sense, what they look like. I've been reading Thomas Bernhard, the Austrian novelist, lately. He's a wonderful writer, unique in his work. To put it in an odd way, his fiction is all words. You don't see anything. Characters or a character in a given novel delivers a book-length interior monologue. There is no sense of place. There may be a place name, like Vienna, but no sense of where a character might be, what a place might look like, what a character might look like, what the weather is. None of this. And I suppose I'm at the opposite end of the spectrum.
I was also struck by what you said about Oswald, though, because I could see two people coming from the same community and having utterly distinct sense of consciousness, perception, visual memory, everything being, never the twain shall meet, too.
That's exactly right, except I knew that he played hooky and went to the Bronx Zoo, and I used to do the same thing, although probably a year or two before he was doing it. And so we had at least that in common. And it was odd for me to discover this, very odd. I thought, what is this kid from Louisiana doing in this half-Italian, half-Jewish part of the Bronx? And there I was suddenly writing the first sentence of the novel that would become Libra.
Let me talk a bit with you, if I may, about your Italian heritage, because I alluded to, before we went on the air, an article by Gay Talese that appeared a number of years ago where he was lamenting the fact that he's talking about the great tradition of Italian storytelling, and he said you see it in American movies with Scorsese and, all these great filmmakers, Coppola. But he was saying at the time, we don't, other than Don DeLillo, we don't seem to have that many extraordinary storytellers of Italian-American heritage, which has probably changed since the time he wrote that. But he couldn't account for it. It didn't make sense to him. When he set it against, for example, all the Jewish-American storytellers or all the Irish-American storytellers. Some thoughts about that?
Let me ask a question. Do the Jewish-American storytellers write consciously, specifically about Jews in America, or are they writing all sorts of fiction about all sorts of people, some of whom happen to be Jewish? And it's really the same with Italians. Italian Americans write about all sorts of things. Think of Gilbert Sorrentino, a brilliant modernist writer, and a number of other writers. When I started writing short stories, I wrote in the traditional sense about what I knew. That meant certain Bronx streets and the people who lived there. And these were Italian Americans. I wasn't very adept as a writer. And in time, as I began to experience different streets and different stimuli, I began to see the world around me in quite a different way. In a curious way, I repeated the immigrant experience of my parents who moved from Italy to America to to find a world of greater possibility. And I suppose I did the same thing. And this is what I found in America. And it's not a coincidence that my first novel is called Americana. I don't think a writer first wants to wear a label with a hyphen in it. I don't think any writer wants that. And if you're an American writer and you need to be categorized, you want to be called an American. And in fact, Mario Puzo said this much more forcefully than I'm saying it now.
So did one of our local writers, Bharati Mukherjee, for example, who feels adamantly and passionately about that, as I think a number of writers who were immigrants feel, because they want to be identified more as American writers. Getting back to place, though, in New York, and in fact there's a whole section where we see the Hasidim, and we get a whole sense of that world, again, from the Stretch limo. But you talk about something you call the Pact of Untouchability in New York, which I was really struck by, because there is some sense of that as you move throughout many of the neighborhoods of New York City.
In the old days, in the immigrant days, of course, there was no such thing as untouchability. They lived in such close quarters that touching was an unthought of part of life. It was just as normal as eating and sleeping. You lived in close contact and you touched people all the time. But I think as the years and decades passed, people began to move among different kinds of other people. And this is where touching became touchy. And in most parts of Manhattan, Midtown, crowded areas in Midtown, you notice how people automatically adopt a code of untouchability. You don't want to brush against someone even lightly. It's a form of self-protection, a form of avoiding hostility, which arises so suddenly in crowded areas, particularly where the population is heterogeneous.
You also don't look at people, especially in places like the subway. That is, you don't.
You
want
never
to,
look
right.
at people if you can possibly help it, and you don't want to get caught looking at someone. It's a grave offense against the code of the city.